Welcome back to Hot Takes and Deep Dives. This is Jess, and you're here on a very special day. We're here. It is December 2nd, 2020. It's Britney's birthday, bitch. And I'm here with the one and only astrologer to the housewives and the pop queens. It's Andy Bellatti, a.k.a. Astrology with Andy. Hey, Andy.
Hey, it is such a pleasure and an honor to be here. And let's just tell your audience briefly, I believe, didn't we come up with this episode idea in March or April or something like that?
We were recording something else, maybe for when I was doing that brief stint, like experimenting with Patreon. At the very end of that, I remember we kind of came up with this idea.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So we've been waiting to be on the cusp of Britney's birthday to really explore this. And you know what's so funny? I have always, for as long as I've been a Britney fan, I've always been hyper aware that December 2nd is her birthday. I've never forgotten that.
And I should know this, but Christina Aguilera's birthday is also around that day.
Her birthday is also in December.
But see, yet again, you know Britney's birthday by heart. And yet we can't remember Christina's. Poor girl.
Again, Christina gets the fucking
And we
shaft.
love her. We're not even throwing shade. We genuinely love Christina. But it's just funny how Britney always eclipses her in even astrologically.
What do you think about Mariah not acknowledging it as a birthday and referring to it as her anniversary?
I think it goes along. You know, I think it adds charm. I think if anybody else did that, it would be really annoying. But some people get away with it.
Yeah.
And I think Mariah is one of them.
So here we are. It's December 2nd, 2020. This is Britney's 39th birthday.
That's right. And by the way, can I share a quick Britney story?
Please. Please.
Okay. Sorry, it just hit me as we were talking that I don't think I ever even told you this. All right. I'll make it very quick. 2003.
Set the stage.
2003. I want to say summer. Yes, summer 03. I am walking on 8th Street. Remember how I haven't been to New York in a while, but remember how 8th Street between University Place and Broadway had all those like kitschy clothing shops?
Mm-hmm.
So I walk into one of them, which was very bizarre for me because I'm not really much of a clothes person, but I walk, it's going to sound crazy, but my intuition said, go into the store. Seriously, I go in. Swear to God, who is looking at who is rifling through the racks? Britney Spears.
What?
Yes.
You never told me that you were in this. Did you meet her?
No, because she had bodyguards around her, and it was a whole thing. And then, and also, I got to tell you, actually, I was kind of in shock. I kind of froze, and then a week later, I had another Britney sighting. This one was, remember the old Tower Records on West 4th and Broadway?
Of course. It's now a gym. It's now Blink Fitness.
Right.
Yeah.
And let's not forget that Britney lived on the top. Well, she had one of her many residences on the top floor of that building. So I'm walking outside of Tower Records and on the West 4th Street side. And there is a black SUV. Again, it's the summer with the back window down. And as I'm walking past the car, I'm walking facing the car. As I walk, I turn to my right and I see that the rear side window is down. And in there is Britney with a bodyguard.
Oh, my God.
So I had two Britney sightings.
How did she look?
She looked really good. This was back in 2000. You know, she did not look disheveled.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, she wasn't made up to like go to an award show. But yeah. So I've had a brush, 2 brushes.
I love it.
And I also got to say that when she was in that clothing store, the bodyguards looked kind of menacing. I think even if maybe I hadn't frozen, their body language made it very clear, please turn around. Like that kind of vibe.
Oh my God. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go through the tentpole moments in Britney's career, like the major moments in her career, particularly as she was breaking and it was really Britney mania in the early days, and then kind of how it's really been her personal life going from, you know, like the mid 2000s into present day. And then we're going to do like what's ahead for Britney.
And as I was working on this chart, it just reminded me of why I love astrology, because it's all in the chart. I mean, you'll see as we do it. It's insane.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So just to start, just as like a baseline, just so everyone is starting at a baseline understanding, once again, just explain the sun, moon, and ascendant, aka the rising sign. Just briefly explain what those are and tell us what are Britney's three main signs.
I refer to these as the three pillars of any birth chart. The sun represents your identity, your sense of self, your ego, healthy ego, how you like to shine. The moon is your emotions, your emotional needs, how you process emotions, how you handle emotions, your emotional world. And the ascendant or the rising sign, they're the same thing. That talks about two things. One is how you come across to people initially, and also kind of how you view life, how you approach new things. Also, from a more evolutionary standpoint, it talks about qualities that you need to integrate in order for your chart to really go to the next level. So there's a bit of an ask in the ascendant of what you need to do to kind of level up. One thing I want to say, the only way that we can determine somebody's rising sign or ascendant is with a birth time. And I have a bit of some trivia here about how Britney's birth time of 1:30 a.m. has been calculated. So in London, there's a very famous astrology store called Equinox, the astrology shop. And one of the astrologers who works there, Barry Street, stated that in November of 2000, Britney, and there's a quote, Britney and her mother had walked in with bodyguards. They cleared the shop and calculated her chart. So according to this guy, and by the way, again, the astrology shop in London is like this huge, very well-known institution. Britney's mother filled out the birth information. And so this birth time that we have of 1:30 a.m. comes from Britney's mother being in London and asking for Britney's chart.
Wow. Okay, so there's no way that this is open for any interpretation. This is fact.
I would say so. I would be very surprised because, again, this is a place that in astrological circles is very well known. I don't think they would just make something up and BS people. So, FYI. All right, with that being said, sun in Sagittarius, moon in Aquarius, rising sign in Libra, which makes a lot of sense because, first of all, with a rising sign in Libra, these are people who tend to be very physically attractive, conventionally attractive, and who have a very charming, warm, gracious persona. If you notice, these three pillars, Sagittarius is a fire sign, Libra and Aquarius are air signs. So when you have your three pillars in fire and air, that tends to give somebody who is very witty and clever and who likes change and who likes things to be quick moving and fast. If you notice, none of these things are in water. So water signs are very emotional. People who are very much about their feelings, their emotions. And also there's not a lot of earth. So earth signs are about practicality, being very methodical, very stable, very kind of predictable. We don't have that. We have a lot of fire and a lot of air, which makes perfect sense for Britney. And what I will say is that when I see the moon in Aquarius, a few things. One is that those are people who, this is the same moon as Erica Jane. Okay?
I love it.
So people who emotionally don't really like to delve into feelings. When it comes to emotions, they like to bolt and run and not even go there. And a lot of times, Moon in Aquarius is people who had very chaotic childhoods. Because the moon also tells me a little bit about the family dynamic growing up and your formative years. And with Aquarius, there's a lot of instability, chaos, unpredictability. One thing I also want to say about Britney's chart is that in your chart at the very bottom, so if your birth chart were the face of a clock, where the 6 o'clock would be, there's a very sensitive angle called the IC. The IC is where your fourth house, which is the house of your home and family, starts. So whatever sign is on the IC gives me a little bit about, again, the family dynamic growing up. And she has that in Capricorn. Capricorn relates to dutifulness, responsibility, hard work. doesn't surprise me that somebody who started essentially making money as a child has Capricorn at the bottom of her chart. And I suspect that with that moon in Aquarius as well, that whole thing about working as a child was the only thing that Britney felt was stable in her life, because her home life with moon in Aquarius was probably very, very unstable and chaotic.
As she became successful, they divorced.
Yeah, and we'll get to what was happening when she really blew up. She actually was going through some really challenging transits. But yeah, already we have here the chart of somebody who did not have an easy childhood. If she came to me as a client, I would definitely ask her about childhood. And what can happen is that when we have the moon in Aquarius, if we don't kind of process and deal with that, we can end up reliving chaotic dynamics. Because I always tell my clients, we can have very difficult things in our chart. The catch-22 is that those very difficult things feel familiar. And a lot of us will repeat those things, even though they're not good for us, because since it's in our chart, we go, oh, this reminds me of when I was young. I know what this is about. And then we keep reliving, though, things that are really toxic, no pun intended, or problematic.
When you said chaotic, I was like, oh, no pun intended.
Oh, that too. That's right. I didn't even mean that on purpose.
And I do know about like the midheaven. Can you talk about that? This is just sort of like, I just want to like, this is just rebasing everybody. The career sector. Can you talk about Britney's midheaven before we get into the actual timeline of things?
Yeah, what's really interesting. So directly opposite the IC. So again, if the chart were a clock, where the 12 o'clock would be, roughly, is where the midheaven is. The midheaven is where the 10th house of career and vocation begins. And what's interesting about Britney's chart is that her midheaven begins in Cancer. Now, the midheaven isn't so much a situation where we go, well, everybody who becomes a pop star has a midheaven in this sign. Because if you look at any career, you will see that people have all sorts of midheavens. But it does tell us about what we need in our career to feel fulfilled. And Cancer is the sign of home and family. So again, what this tells me is that usually these are people who were severely lacking in their actual family life. And so their career becomes the substitute for family. And oftentimes people who have the midheaven in Cancer are people who commonly will hire friends and family, or their coworkers. And I understand that Britney doesn't really have coworkers, but let's say her team becomes her family. Oftentimes, people who have the midheaven in Cancer will never really fire somebody just because to them it's like, but this person's like my family. So Britney actually needs a work environment that feels like a family and is very protective. And I suspect it's because she's kind of making up for what she didn't have growing up. She wanted to create it in her vocational life.
Makes complete sense. All right, let's jump in. Why don't we start at 1999, 2000, sort of like 1998 through 2000. This is when Baby One More Time and the Oops albums this was really at the height of Britney mania. Give me what is the insight from those early days?
So in October of 98, Baby One More Time, the single, is released. And one thing that's very interesting in her chart is that what was happening then is that she had the planet Saturn supporting her midheaven. And to be clear, this doesn't happen. It's not like it happens once a year, once every 5 years. It happens very rarely. But Saturn is about laying down a new foundation that is very solid and stable that you can then build off of for years. So oftentimes when somebody has Saturn supporting the midheaven, that usually points to the start of something that has the potential to then carry you through for years, a very significant beginning. Now, in most people's charts, if they have this when they are 16 years old, it kind of is a moot point, because I always say, the planets don't care about how we view things here on Earth. So sometimes I have a client who had the most amazing career transits when they're 4 years old. And it's kind of like, well, sorry about it, right?
Yeah.
But she happened to be in show business. And so at 16, she was able to kind of live out this transit. So already to me, it's very interesting that releasing her first single during that kind of transit really set the stage for it having legs. Then we get to January of 99 when Baby One More Time, the album, is released. And what's fascinating about this is that Britney had two major transits going on. One happens once in your lifetime, if ever, which is when Pluto sits right on top of your sun. I say once in a lifetime because if you even have this in your life, it's once every 244 years. Pluto transits are the most transformative of any. You know, Pluto is the idea of huge transformation, metamorphosis. It's death and rebirth. A part of you dies, a brand new part of you is born. And she had this transit all through 1999, from January of 99 until November of 2000. When Pluto is on your sun, your life changes from top to bottom. Once the transit is over, so in her case, November of 2000, you look back at when the transit started, January of 99, and you look back and go, oh my God, everything has changed. It's almost like 20 years have gone by.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not surprised that that's when she became this mega star. Now, I will say, and this is where, you know, different charts, different people, for some people, Pluto on top of your sun is extremely difficult and extremely challenging. But not always. Sometimes, like in Britney's case, is when you go from a nobody, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but from nobody knowing you to being this global superstar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, also what she had in 1999 for pretty much the whole year was the planet Uranus on top of her moon. The moon is my emotional world, and Uranus brings sudden changes. So Uranus has to do with things like lightning and earthquakes and electricity. Your life gets supercharged. To have both of those transits simultaneously, without a doubt, was going to be a time that was going to be, in her life, probably one of the most life-changing moments in her entire life. And this is when she went, again, from having, you know, a debut single that sure had some hits, to then during this time, you know, she had two albums come out that were huge at the time. Her second album broke all sorts of records. Also, when she started dating Justin, which, you know, when you start dating somebody or you start a relationship, I always take a look at what's happening in your chart because it gives me an indication of what's kind of the energy around this relationship. And without a doubt, the fact that she started dating Justin during these transits meant that this was going to be also for her a life-changing relationship.
And let's fast forward to 2002. What was going on when the breakup happened? Because we know that she famously cheated on him with Wade Robson, the choreographer who was a big collaborator of, you know, he was the choreographer for NSYNC, and he wrote a bunch of music with Justin. They even wrote together the song that What It's Like to Be Me, which is on Britney's album.
Right.
So what was going on, and like, why did she do this?
Well, the most interesting thing that was happening in 2002 in her chart is that, well, two things. First, she had the planet Saturn challenging her sun.
What does that mean?
Well, Saturn, when it's challenging your sun, usually brings some kind of test and usually brings an ending. And usually that ending relates to something no longer being sustainable. What's interesting is that simultaneously, at the same time as she had Saturn opposite her sun, which usually brings some kind of significant ending with a significant lesson that you need to learn, is that she had an asteroid that is named Chiron sitting right on top of her IC. Again, the IC is the very bottom of your chart. Chiron is an asteroid that is known as the wounded healer, and it usually relates to some kind of wound that we carry from childhood that we have to address in order to be healthy. When Chiron crosses the IC, usually what happens is that childhood issues begin to reemerge. So what I suspect happened, based on looking at Chiron crossing the IC while Saturn challenges her sun, I think that because, based on her chart, I don't think Britney had a very healthy role modeling of emotions and a healthy relationship dynamic. I think that she subconsciously, which is very common with Chiron, wanted to do something to not really shake things up per se, but I think she subconsciously sabotaged the relationship because I think that whole dynamic of a long-term relationship just freaked her out. And because, when I see Saturn challenging the sun, the way that could play out, because Saturn is a planet of adulting and responsibility, that can be a time when somebody goes, I now really want to take this to the next level. I want us to be maybe totally exclusive, or I want us to get engaged, or I want us to move in together. But if you're not quite there yet emotionally, Saturn makes that feel so oppressive that you go, oh, I don't want this. And with her moon in Aquarius, again, the moon in Aquarius, when things get emotionally heavy, the default mode, which you have to work on, the default mode is to bolt, to run. I don't want to talk about it. I want to burn the bridge. So I think subconsciously this activated her Aquarius moon, that maybe instead of telling Justin, I don't know, maybe this is getting a little bit too serious for me or whatever, I think she subconsciously broke it, took actions that she knew would result in the ending of that relationship.
Things that would be irrevocably damaged. I
want to be clear that based on what I see in her chart, I'm not seeing Britney having like the time of her life in 2002 saying, I'm going to just hook up with Wade Robson and live my life. She was going through a really difficult time in 2002.
Let's jump ahead to 2004. This was the year where she was in Vegas on New Year's Eve. She had the 55-hour marriage to her childhood friend, Jason Alexander. And then eventually later that year, she would meet Kevin Federline. What was going on during this year?
Yeah, 2004 was quite the year. Because let's not forget, too, that it started with that 55-hour marriage. And then later in the year, she married K-Fed.
Mm-hmm.
It was and then also that's also when she had that injury while she was touring. That then
was the injury while she was touring? Because I remember she had another big knee injury shooting the Outrageous music video. Was that later on?
No, you're right. That's the one.
It was the injury that damaged her knee forever. And that's when people say like she never was able to dance the way she was able to dance prior to this. And the injury is actually captured on film because they were shooting the Outrageous video.
Yes, exactly. This is the injury from June of 2004 when she was shooting in New York. And from my understanding, that is the injury that kind of not derailed her dancing, but ever since then, it wasn't the same. So when I look at 2004, she had two very significant transits and very challenging ones. Let's start with the personal life first. This is when she had the planet Neptune right on top of her moon. So again, the moon is my emotions. Neptune, when it comes to sit on top of something, spews out a bunch of mist and fog and makes it very confusing. Here's how I describe Neptune. Let's say you're walking in the woods. Scenario A, without Neptune. It's a very sunny day. You're walking in the woods. You see everything. Visibility is perfect. You have a perfect sense of direction. Scenario B, walking in the woods with Neptune. You're doing that at 2 a.m. It's a new moon, so there's not even a moon in the sky. It's completely dark. There's fog all around you. Suddenly, you have no sense of direction. You can't see in front of you. You hear a noise and you're like, is that a squirrel or is that a bear? Because I can't see shit. Mm-hmm. That is Neptune. Neptune on your moon is basically, Neptune's clouds of confusion affect your emotional life. In fact, I always tell my clients that when they're going through a Neptune transit, I recommend not making any important decisions. Things like engagements and marriages, because Neptune is also idealizing, putting people on pedestals, and wearing rose-colored glasses. When you're going through a Neptune transit, what you see is not what you get. This is why Neptune rules optical illusions. You have to wait until the transit is over to have a clear head. Alas, during this transit, Britney got married twice. And what was happening here, the fact that she married that Jason Alexander for, which, by the way, I always think of the actor from Seinfeld when I say that name. But that she married somebody and then 55 hours later was like, oh, never mind. That is so Neptune, because when Neptune rules drugs and alcohol for that reason. Neptune completely distorts your judgment. So there was that throughout the entire year. Then back to the midheaven, what was happening in that year, she had the planet Saturn crossing her midheaven. Saturn is about limits and restrictions and obstacles and delays. When Saturn crosses your midheaven, oftentimes what happens is that there's some kind of setback that negatively impacts your career. There's delays, there's waiting. So the fact, and what's interesting is that Saturn rules bones. So I'm not surprised that she injured her knee, which had a huge effect on her career. And as a result of that, she had to postpone a tour, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah.
That is Saturn on the midheaven. So a very challenging year with both, Neptune challenging her moon and Saturn challenging her midheaven. A very, very challenging time for her.
And what do you make just in general of the whole Kevin Federline relationship? Like the entire scope of it?
Well, it's interesting because again...
Was it again just like poor judgment?
It was, because when she first met Justin, she was going through, Pluto on top of her sun, Uranus on top of her moon. That relationship was life-changing and transformative and kind of electric. Starting a brand new relationship when you have Neptune on top of your moon, you are seeing what you want to see. I think she projected a lot of her fantasies onto Kevin Federline. And I'm not, I really hate this narrative that, Kevin Federline is like the devil and Britney's like this angel. I think everybody is a mixed bag. What I will say is that she entered that relationship without really knowing what was what. So I'm not surprised that it ended up the way it did. I also, the thing too is that Neptune is also daydreams and fantasies and the fairy tale. So I think that when they met, Britney was under this kind of Neptune spell. And I can see how for her initially it must have been like a daydream. She probably felt like she was in a fairy tale, but it wasn't reality.
What did you make of that Chaotic, the reality show? I was obsessed. And it's all still on YouTube.
Me too. So first of all, the fact that it was on the UPN network, I thought was kind of interesting.
Great theme song, by the way.
Yes. Oh, yes. And, I was also shifting quickly to another pop diva who I worship. It was like the precursor to being Bobby Brown, because, Bobby Brown.
You're so right.
Was showing Whitney being Whitney as I loved her. And it was like this precursor where suddenly Britney was not this glam, very carefully crafted PR image. It was Britney, drinking Frappuccinos, eating Cheetos, barefoot, with a handheld camera in bed with Kevin Federline.
Why did she do this show?
Neptune on her moon. Like, again, clouded judgment, right? So this is why, and this is why actually I want to make this point that a lot of times celebrities have a very hard time with Neptune transits, because when you have a Neptune transit, one of the things, a challenging Neptune transit, one of the things that can save you is having some kind of grounding cable. People in your life who can tell you, no, don't do that. But celebrities are notorious for having yes people around them, especially when you are at Britney's level, where nobody says no to you. Everybody just says, yes, you're perfect, you're amazing. And I believe that at the time, I don't think she had anybody in her team or circle who was a grounding influence.
Okay, moving on. The infamous 2007. So this was January and February 2007. This is the head shaving, the infamous umbrella incident. What was going on here? And also at the end of 2007 was when she lost custody of her kids to Kevin Federline. This was the breakup year, head shaving, and umbrella.
When I was looking at her chart, to me, this particular narrative actually begins in November of 2006. Because that's when she filed for divorce from K-Fed. And also, what a lot of people tend to forget is that in January of 2007, what also happened is that one of Britney's aunts passed away, who apparently she was very close to. Well, what started at the end of 2006 and was still active the beginning of 2007 was that she had the planet Uranus challenging her sun. And what I mean by challenging is that Uranus was 90 degrees away from her sun. Uranus, when it's challenging your sun, brings unexpected situations that you have to react to. Again, think of an earthquake. You cannot predict it, but suddenly your life is upended, right? If you're just minding your business and an earthquake happens and your house is in shambles, you suddenly now have to react to this totally unexpected event. So usually when somebody is going through a Uranus transit, they experience situations where the status quo suddenly gets upended. So there was that. And, Uranus is this very chaotic, unexpected, unpredictable energy. And what I often tell my clients when they have a Uranus transit, a challenging Uranus transit coming up, is I tell them to avoid being impulsive, because when we have a challenging Uranus transit, we suddenly, out of nowhere, can feel very oppressed. And what we want to do is, unshackle ourselves and kind of go crazy. So there was that. Also, however, active in 2007 was that she had the planet Neptune challenging her Chiron. And again, Chiron is these childhood wounds, these wounds that we carry. And when Neptune challenges Chiron, we can suddenly feel overwhelmed by trauma that we have not addressed. I suspect that part of what led Britney to what she did in 2007 was that I think pretty significant trauma was unearthed for her. I know that it became, the meme with the umbrella and all this stuff, but she was going through some heavy shit at that time. And I think, again, because she wasn't maybe able to work through it or process it, and that's not a judgment on her, but that's why I think it played out the way it did. What I want to make very clear is that, other people who have gone through a similar transit, if they maybe had been in therapy, or if they had a circle around them that was very grounding and talking to them about how they needed to get help, they would have lived it out differently. So I'm not trying to make it seem, I always tell people, we are not puppets and the planets are not puppet masters. It's not like we have no say in what we do. What these transits do is they bring up situations, and then depending where we are in our life, we act in different ways.
So what's most interesting about 2007 is that in the course of all of this personal upheaval, she writes and produces, in fact A&R'd the entirety of the Blackout album and releases it on October 30th, 2007. And this is the album that would go on to be what is perhaps most critically revered as the highlight of her career.
Wasn't the Blackout album considered a huge change for her in her musical direction and very alternative in a way?
Well, it changed the sound of pop music. It changed the landscape of pop music. For years after, everything after Blackout was just trying to do Blackout again.
So I'm not surprised that during that transit, she recorded that kind of album. So that is good in the sense that she was able to use all that Uranus energy of upending the status quo creatively. She was able to tap into it. But we see what it did for her emotionally.
So Blackout is released October 30th, 2007. January 2008 is the 5150 psych ward and when the conservatorship begins. I want to go very deep about this.
So this is when we go back to Saturn. So again, it's not that Saturn is a bad planet, because Saturn, as we saw, was very active when her first single was released. Saturn, when it's helping you out, gives you this capacity to focus and lay down a foundation that is so solid and stable that you can, build a skyscraper on it. However, when Saturn challenges, it brings major reality checks. And it's not because Saturn is, a planet that wants to punish you or you have bad karma or any of that nonsense. It's simply because Saturn audits your life. And when things are off the rails, they can be off the rails, but then at some point Saturn comes around and goes, stop, everybody, kind of like in Crazy, stop.
Yeah,
That's what
the Stop
Saturn
remix,
does.
yes.
Yeah, that's what Saturn does. So in January 2008, the planet Saturn was challenging, meaning that it was 90 degrees away from her Mercury and her Sun. Now, Mercury has to do, among other things, with contracts that we have. Mercury is also our communication, our capacity to have opinions, to think, all that. And the sun is our identity. When Saturn squares Mercury and the sun, and this happened for her January and February of 2008, and then July, August, September 2008, suddenly we kind of hit a brick wall if we've been going off the rails. Now, for some people, if things have been going fine, the worst that this transit will be is just maybe a time of a lot of hard work, not a lot of fun. But if things have really been going off the rails, Saturn comes along and suddenly it's kind of like boot camp. It's like, life boot camp where you have a sergeant or, a drill sergeant that is basically telling you what to do and you have no freedom. Not surprised, this is when the conservatorship started and also the 5150, because that is Saturn. This idea of having your freedoms curtailed and suddenly having all these limitations is very Saturn. But again, in a way, that Saturn transit kind of saved her life. I think if she wasn't through a Saturn transit, nobody would have stopped that train. And I don't even want to think what would have happened.
Yeah, like potentially, like what could have happened? Just like an overdose, like something like that?
Yes, because one thing in Britney's chart, if she came to me as a client, one thing I would be totally counseling her on is her Mars. She has Mars in the 12th house.
Can you talk about Mars? Like, what is Mars the indicator of?
So Mars is about my desires. Mars is action, assertiveness, right? Mars, when it's healthy, says, I want to go to that destination and I'm going for it. The 12th house is the murkiest house of all in the chart. And anything that is in the 12th house gets diluted. So when you have somebody who has Mars in the 12th, that already is a bit of a problem, because what can often happen is that I start putting my own desires aside. I start living to fulfill other people's desires. But also what's really problematic is that she has Mars in a challenging aspect to her Neptune. Now, Neptune rules drugs and alcohol. The 12th house, which is where Mars is, also relates to escaping and numbing. When somebody has Mars in the 12th, there can be the probability of developing an addiction, especially because Neptune rules alcohol, but also any drug like Prozac. That's very Neptune. When you look at astrology, there's different planets that rule different kinds of substances, but because Neptune rules dreams and fantasies, it's downers. Mm-hmm. So when I see Mars in the 12th square Neptune, again, I always say that astrology is like a weather forecast. We're not talking about absolutes. We're talking about probability. Kind of like how a weather forecast says, 90% chance of rain or 20% chance of rain. With this kind of Mars aspect, developing an addiction to substances is about a 70 to 80%, especially because she has this moon in Aquarius, as I was saying earlier, which instead of communicating emotions or processing emotions goes, oh, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about that. But all that stuff gets stored somewhere. And if you're not letting it out with this kind of Mars, Neptune, Mars in the 12th, what can happen is, I don't want to talk about it. I want to just escape, and often through substances.
Let's walk into 2009. This is when Sam Lufty came into her life. And from what I understand, he was just a guy who was a friend of hers who would become her manager. And then it kind of went dark and resulted in a restraining order. What was going on there?
I believe, wasn't he at some point a paparazzi? Yeah, or a paparazzo, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, wasn't that how they met? Where I think that he used to be a paparazzo, and I think he then kind of started ingratiating himself into Britney's circle. Mm-hmm. So I have quite a bit to say about 2009, but before I talk about that, I want to explain why Britney is very susceptible to people like Sam Lufty. In her birth chart, because correct me if I'm wrong, didn't they date?
I think they did as well. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I want to just briefly mention this. In Britney's chart, she has the planet Venus. Now, Venus is about our relationships, romantic relationships, among other things, but romantic relationships. She has Venus in a square. Again, a square is a challenging aspect. When I mention challenging aspects, just think of two planets that are not getting along and their relationship is way off balance, okay? In a challenging aspect to Pluto. Now, Pluto, when it's involved in a challenging aspect, is about control and manipulation and obsession and jealousy. People who have Pluto square Venus have to be very, very careful because they can either become obsessed with people to the point where they will not stop until they date this person, or they can't stop thinking about somebody. Or what happens too is that you subconsciously attract people who play out all those really negative Pluto aspects. And negative Pluto aspects are control and narcissism and people who just want to run your life. So Britney is very susceptible to people like Sam Lutfi, especially because, again, going back to that Mars in the 12th, Mars in the 12th can have a hard time asserting itself.
Jumping ahead to 2013, this is the start of the Vegas residency. My hunch is that this is a time where she was just very stable. She's working every night. She eventually put out the Britney Jean album, which I don't know if there's anything in there that you want to discuss. But what was going on 2013? It seems like it was a very healthy place for her. At least she was living in one place, performing every night.
Yeah, so a few things career-wise. One thing that was happening during the residency, when the residency started, is that she had the planet Jupiter traveling through her 10th house of career. So this happens once every 12 years.
And what does Jupiter signify?
Jupiter has to do, when it's traveling through a part of your chart, it's about where you're going to experience abundance, growth, opportunities. And, she last, just to briefly reference, prior to 2013, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, she last had Jupiter in her 10th house from July of 2001 to July of 2002. And, that is when her third album is released. Slave for You comes out. She has that iconic performance at the MTV VMAs with the Python.
Mm-hmm.
And Crossroads comes out. Now, sure, you might say, well, she didn't get an Oscar for that. No, but Jupiter being about opportunities and expansion, she's now expanding into film. So similarly, when she began the residency, Jupiter, abundance, expansion, growth in her career. Also, though, I looked at the exact date of the residency when it debuted, December 27, 2013. During the time, she also had Mars. Mars is action, assertiveness. It's forward movement and momentum in traveling through her first house. The first house is, when you have Mars traveling through your first house, you're usually beginning something that is very dynamic.
And they were going to start a brand new residency, and then it abruptly was canceled, which led into the Free Britney movement. What do you make of all of that? The chaos that was going on at the end of 2018?
Yeah, and let's not forget that, there's a very interesting time, because also in April of 2019, Britney checked herself into a mental health facility. And that's when she published an Instagram post that the caption was, "Fall in love with taking care of yourself, mind, body, spirit." Right? So I remember when this happened, really looking at her chart. And remember how I mentioned that in 2002, when she broke up with Justin, one of the things that was happening is that asteroid named Chiron, about wounds and childhood wounds, was crossing over a very sensitive angle in her chart. Well, in 2018 to 2019, Chiron was once again crossing another angle in her chart. So when we have Chiron crossing these angles in our chart, that happens about every 15, 16 years. A lot of times, any unresolved baggage comes up. So that's one very significant thing that was happening. And again, Chiron as a wounded healer brings up unresolved issues, insecurities, fears, and wounds to light so they can be addressed. P.S. I just remembered this. In 2007, Chiron was right on top of her moon. Chiron, wounds, moon, emotions. We can see again why 2007 was so challenging.
Jumping to today, so now it's December 2nd, 2020. What do you make of the strange Instagram posts, the videos? There's a lot going on with the conservatorship. She had a change in lawyers this year. What is going on currently in her chart? Just basically the whole Free Britney movement. There's a bit of conspiracy theories that she's giving subliminal messages like, oh, if she like touches her eye 3 times, it means XYZ. Like, what the fuck?
Well, so right now she experienced, because again, this is Britney's chart, so I got to talk about it's how she experiences life. I think this year she experienced some major restrictions to her freedom and some setbacks and disappointment. She had the planet Saturn really challenging her Venus, sitting right on top of it, which happens every 29 years.
And what does what does that mean?
So that's a time when things just suddenly feel particularly oppressive for us. And as a result of that, I think that the only way that she's able to therefore express her creativity and her wanting to be free is through these social media posts. Because again, not that anybody wants to ever be in a conservatorship, but for somebody who has a moon in Aquarius, who is all about freedom, it's really difficult for her. And I think the only way that she knows to express that Aquarius moon is by, doing these TikToks and these Instagram videos that are interesting, I guess you can describe them. But again, when I look at her transits right now, especially 2020, she's not going through an easy time at all. And I got to say that the coming year for her is going to be challenging.
Do you see any hints as to like creativity or the career, like anything in the next like 5-10 years?
So I would say, there's some hints of that coming up in 2022 when she'll have some supportive aspects from Jupiter to her midheaven. Jupiter, now it's not the same as Jupiter crossing the midheaven in the 10th house when she had the residency and the Slave for You performance, but there's a little bit of support here to her midheaven and to her career. And let me actually give you the dates for that. There's actually a little bit of that happening May and June of 21, and then December 21, January 22. But this is more of a supportive transit if she were to use it. This kind of Jupiter transit is more like if you want it, it's there, but it's not that significant where it's going to happen anyway. I would watch, not for career reasons, but for the conservatorship. There's going to be, on May 26th of 2021, there's going to be a lunar eclipse that's going to happen right on top of her Mercury. So a lunar eclipse is like a supercharged full moon. And if a lunar eclipse either falls on your birthday or falls right on top of or very close to one of your personal planets, Mars, Mercury, Venus, that can be significant. I say the conservatorship because Mercury rules contracts. And a lunar eclipse brings a significant, usually something is coming to an end. Now, lunar eclipses work where either there's a significant event around the time of the eclipse, so again, May 26th, give or take 3 days, or 30 days after, so June 26th, give or take 3 days, or if not, 6 months to the day, so November 26th of 2021, give or take 3 days. But that tells me that we might hear some news around that. Career-wise, I would say the next time that Britney's going to have a significant moment will be around 2025.
What do you see there?
That's when, once again, she has Jupiter at the top of her chart in the midheaven. That was when she had the residency and, crossroads. That energy comes back in 2025.
That's good.
Yeah, that's something that she can look forward to. And that, I think, who knows? There might be maybe an autobiography. I don't know.
2025, maybe. We don't know what it'll be, but maybe it'll be a song. Maybe it'll be an album. Who knows? Maybe we'll be out of all of this and she'll kick up another residency. We don't know what it'll look like. Maybe it'll be a memoir. Who knows? Give us a positive note to end on, Andy.
So yes, you're right. Let's end on a positive note because there actually is one. And it has to do with Saturn. Now, again, this is healthy, supportive Saturn, which is what she had when she was full on in residency mode, working nonstop. And this actually does begin for her in March of 21. It's going to be in effect throughout 21 and even into February of 22. So a few things happening there. During that time, she's going to have Saturn supporting her sun, which will be helpful because I think one thing that'll happen for her in the coming year is that although she will be going through some changes, I think as a result of them, she will begin to feel more secure, more stable. And then into 22, she'll have Saturn in a very supportive angle to itself, again, meaning that where Saturn will be in 2021 and mainly beginning of 22 will be in a very supportive angle to where Saturn was when she was born. Then as we keep going through 2022, she will also have Saturn in a very supportive aspect to her Pluto. All of that tells me that while she will be going through some upheavals, one thing that will come out of all that will be a sense of stability for her. That I think, in a way, what I'm seeing, and also kind of getting intuitively, because sometimes I got to say when I'm reading charts, I just get an intuitive sense. I think that what'll happen in 21 and 22, whatever it is, because I always say this is not a psychic reading, I don't see things, but will in some way be the very beginnings of whatever she does career-wise in 25. So maybe in 22 is when she gets an idea of maybe beginning to write a memoir, and then maybe it's released in 25, or maybe the writing process happens more in 25. But there's something about 21 and 22 for her that I think will give her a sense of it's been very hectic and I want to use this to do something else.
As a Britney fan, what do you want most? Do you want a memoir? Do you want a new album? Or do you want live performance?
I want a memoir. I do, because don't get me wrong. I've been to see Britney here in Vegas. If people don't know, I do live in Vegas, and it was the most fun show I've been to. She didn't sing a single note live, but it was fun. And it was great to see her. But I could, with this chart, now I get it. Britney is not, she's not going to be a Rhodes Scholar. However, with this chart, she actually has quite a lot to say. There's a chart that when I look at it, I'm like, I bet there's some really interesting, not always fun, but very interesting stories here. And would I go see her again if she performs? Sure. But at this point, I really want to get to know the quote unquote real Britney. So that's what I would want. What would you want?
That's a good note to end on. I want another album. I want another album in the vein of In the Zone and Glory.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I want a trip hoppy sort of vibey album. Like I want her to work with those producers again from Glory. Like I love that album. Like those really were my two favorites, In the Zone and Glory. So yeah, like I listen, like I always want new music. Good new music. I don't want music just for the sake of it,
Yeah. So we'll have to see. But, I will say her career's not over for sure. She's going to have, I think, again, I'd be looking at 2025 for some kind of rebirth, or she's coming back in the spotlight in 25.
Very good. Who was another huge persona like this that you have gone through and done their entire chart?
Well, great question, because, I have dabbled a little bit in some celebrity charts here or there, but as you were asking that question, two major icons who I would love to do a deep dive on their chart, and I kind of never did, are Michael Jackson and Whitney Houston.
Oh, wow. I'd be more interested in Whitney, I think.
Yeah, I bet you that chart would be a very interesting one to read.
All right, yeah. we can think about that.
There's a few celebrities that I like to look at there, especially, one thing I love to do just for myself, and sometimes I post it on Instagram, is when there's a huge celebrity story, I like to look at what's happening astrologically and I post about it. but it's more in that vein. I'll look at what's happening right then and there. This is the first time really that I do a huge deep dive, like chronologically about one person.
And where can everyone follow you on Instagram? And I know you have a blog where you write like real sort of like long form essay posts you did about the election and of course about the pandemic. Where can everybody find all that stuff?
On Instagram, you can find me Astrology with Andy. And you can read my blog by going to my website, astrologywithandy.com. There's a blog there. And also, if you want to book a reading with me, simply click on services. I offer 9 or 10 different kinds of astrological services. And I got to tell you, I have met a lot of your listeners.
What do they have to say?
Well, first of all, they all adore you. It's like the Jess fan club. I'm like, okay, I'm glad you love Jess, but we're doing a reading. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, and they're all so fun. They're just really, I love your listeners. You know, when somebody, because I always like to ask when I have a new client, I always like to ask, how did you hear about me?
Yeah.
And very often I heard you on Hot Takes Deep Dives. And I love that. So thanks as always for having me.
I love it. Andy, we will do something again soon. Are you watching any Housewives? Like, what are you watching? Are you still rewatching season 2 of Jersey?
You know, I was going to say, I feel so lame because 9 times out of 10, I'm watching repeats of my favorite seasons. In fact, the other day, I once again watched Bethany and Ramona walking on the Brooklyn Bridge. So that's what I like to do. In fact, I often like to fall asleep to that. There's something very soothing about it. I don't know what it is.
It tucks you in.
It does. I love it.
Oh my God. Andy, you're the best. Thank you for this. This was a lot of work. Thank you. Guys, you can follow me on Instagram, JessXNYC. Definitely follow the show account, Hot Takes Deep Dives. I promote all the episodes. You can kind of keep an eye on what's coming up. And Andy and I will see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.